Hi, this is Steve Rutledge, and today I'm coming to you from the editing desk of Get That Right. We just finished a 4-part series about combining sentences using coordination, semicolons, colons, and subordination. Today we're going to review and see how much you've learned. Our first video introduced coordination. Not this kind of coordination, but this kind of coordination.
Enter coordination. Coordination is when you link two or more sentences with a coordinating conjunction. And it helps your reader understand how the sentences relate and helps them read more smoothly.
Here I explain the key to understanding coordination.
The key to using coordination correctly is knowing the conjunctions and the relationships they create between the sentences. Many people remember coordinations through the acrostic fanboys. Not these kinds of fanboys. These kinds of fanboys. For, and, nor, but, or, yet. And what's the last one? Oh yeah. So, one note. Notice every time I used a coordinating conjunction, I placed a comma before it. Almost always, when you join two sentences with a coordinating conjunction, you precede that conjunction with a comma.
Keep in mind, if you struggle with comma splices, coordination can be a great way to fix that mistake.
Side note, if your English teacher tells you, "Dude, you're struggling with comma splices," then you can fix the comma splice by adding a coordinating conjunction. Let me give you an example. Libertarianism works when people have equal access to resources. Unfortunately, equal access is not always the case. Comma splice. So that word group would be a comma splice because it places just a comma between two complete thoughts. What coordinating conjunction would work between these two sentences?
Here's some practice questions. Another way to coordinate two complete sentences is to use a semicolon. Remember the key. Both sides of a semicolon must be sentences. Here I explain how best to use a semicolon.
A period is a strong pause. A comma is a gentle pause. So a semicolon is a mix of the two punctuation marks. It has a period showing that it's separating two complete sentences, but it has a comma saying, hey, these two sentences are related. The best thing I can do is show you some word groups that use semicolons really well to separate sentences that are closely related. Losing a football game hurts. Losing because of a last-second fumble by your senior quarterback devastates. It's awesome how those two sentences with the repeated word losing sort of roll together, and so the semicolon works better than a strong period to separate them.
Remember, semicolons are for sentences that have a special relationship.
For as you know, sentences can stand by themselves. But one day, Antoine met Martina, and the two discovered that they had much in common. Much in common. Much in common. In fact, so much in common that the two sentences simply fell in love. Well, now that they were sentences in love, they realized that the period was far too strong a punctuation mark to separate them. And so they created the semicolon, with a comma to represent how much they had in common, and a period to remind everyone that they were, after all, both sentences. All right. So let's save semicolons for when sentences are holding hands.
Here I offer one final word of advice about semicolons.
Side note number 2.
don't overuse semicolons. I think a good rule of thumb is 1 semicolon per paragraph. Now, why is that? Do you remember the animated feature, The Incredibles? Great villain they had in there called Syndrome. He had this amazing line, "When everyone's super, no one will be." Great line. Hey, it's the same with writing. If every punctuation mark in a paragraph is a semicolon, then none of the sentences are special. Speaking of special, you ought to save semicolons for sentences that have a special relationship. Let's do some practice. Most of us have used colons with lists. So yes, a colon can and often is used to separate a sentence from a list. Here's another example. Clanking in home water pipes can have many causes. Colon, air in the system, a corroded water heater, drastic changes in temperature, and so forth. Notice that the colon signals that what will follow will be a list of the causes of water pipe clanking. But not everything that looks like a list in a sentence needs a colon. For example, does this list need a colon? His symptoms include a scratchy throat, runny nose, and mild fever. How about this one? After games, we always went to my friend's house for pizza and to watch highlights. Here's a more serious but eloquent example. My parents' divorce sunk me into depression, wasted thousands of dollars we didn't have, and initiated the gut-wrenching choice of whom to live with. Powerful sentence. So why didn't these 3 lists need colons? First, there's a technical answer. Generally, you do not place a colon when the list comes after a preposition, like it does in this one. Similarly, you usually do not place a colon when the list comes after a verb, like it does here. But if that's all too technical an explanation for you, just think of it this way. In all 3 cases, you could read the sentence smoothly without a pause. So if the list is not offset by a pause, you probably don't need a colon. Put another way, if there is no pause, then there is no cause for a colon before the list. What most people don't know is you can also use a colon to separate sentences. Wow, quite a list. But do you see how what followed the colon completed or further explained the first thought? This last word group talks about the world of comics, and by comics, I mean comic books, animated series, films like The Avengers, and so forth. It's no fun being bullied, and that's where comics provide relief. Colon. So again, we're waiting around to find out, well, how do comics provide relief? And that colon signals what follows is going to complete the thought. In a comic world, that which makes someone weird, Plastic Man and his flexibility, Flash and his speed, Batman and his obsession with gadgets, also makes them powerful. So bullies had better beware. So a colon can signal that the word, phrase, or sentence which will follow is going to complete the thought of the first sentence. It's important to keep in mind that both semicolons and colons can separate sentences, but they do so in different situations. I try to explain that here. Here's a challenge for you. In the next word group, one pair of sentences needs a semicolon to separate it because the 2 sentences, while they can stand alone, are related. The other set of sentences needs a colon because the second sentence completes the first. Which word group would get the semicolon? Which word group would get the colon? Try it out. Sometimes the world of comics is angry. Sometimes it is beautiful. But regardless, it's always an escape. And that's why I love comics.
They are my escape into another universe. Well, the first pair of sentences would get the semicolon because both those statements are complete thoughts that could stand alone. They're just closely related. But notice in the second group, the second sentence completes the first. To put another way, the first sentence is not complete without the second. And that's when you use a colon. Hey, I got to tell you about one final use of colons I really like, and that is taking a complete sentence, placing a colon, and then placing a quote that completes the thought of the first sentence. Here's an example. Steve Jackson describes the plight of student athletes whose scholarships don't cover all college expenses. Colon, student athletes need money to live. You can't eat your athletic scholarship. Neither will your athletic scholarship wash the laundry, pump the gas, or search the internet for you. Notice how the quote completes the thought Stephen Jackson has about the plight of student athletes. So let's summarize. Our first point was you can use colons to separate a sentence from a list. But remember, not all lists require colons. You usually do not place a colon if the list comes after a verb, preposition, or just simply remember, if there is no pause, then there's probably no cause for a colon before the list. Let me summarize my final point. Colons work well after a sentence when the word, phrase, sentence, or even quote that follows it further explains or completes the first sentence.
Finally, subordination. Remember, coordination uses a comma plus a fanboys to join sentences. Subordination uses a subordinating conjunction, making one of the sentences into a subordinate clause. I don't know if you caught it, but I actually show you the difference between the two in this sentence right here.
We've talked about coordination, where you use a comma plus coordinating conjunction to smoothly combine two sentences. And now today we've talked about subordination, where you use a subordinate clause to make one sentence serve the other.
Here I explain comma use with subordination.
What about punctuation? Notice in our first three examples that there's no punctuation needed between the independent clause and the subordinate clause. But generally, if you take the subordinate clause and place it first, you now have a pause, and a pause is a cause for punctuation. What punctuation mark would work well when you begin a sentence with a subordinating clause? That's right, a comma, because a comma works inside of a sentence to say, pause a second, and now I'm going to complete the thought. So let's summarize. If you have two sentences that seem to almost be fighting one another, make one sentence serve the other by using a subordinating conjunction, turning the second sentence into a subordinate clause. When the subordinate clause comes second, you usually do not need a comma. However, if you place the subordinate clause first, then usually you'll want to place a comma after it.
Finally, remember the main mistake people make with subordination.
The error I see students make the most with subordinating conjunctions and clauses is with a semicolon. They might write a sentence something like this. Experiment results changed, semicolon, after the precipitate fully hardened. Wait a minute. Remember, both sides of a semicolon are supposed to be sentences. Is the second word group a complete thought? No, it's a subordinate clause. It is not a complete thought. Therefore, it cannot be a sentence. Sometimes students will reverse the mistake by putting the subordinating conjunction first. After the precipitate fully hardened, semicolon, experiment results changed. But that's still the same error. Remember, both sides of a semicolon or of a period need to be complete thoughts. Once you put a subordinating conjunction in, you're no longer going to have a complete thought. So the semicolon or the period would not be an appropriate choice.
One note. In the video, I showed you a short list of a few subordinating conjunctions. It's important to know that there are actually many, many, many subordinating conjunctions, as you can see in this big list here. Okay, now that we've reviewed, let's see how much you've learned with this quiz. Good luck.